coming for what I think is the third YOHRS seminar of this academic year. Over the course of the last few years, I've had a few people who have been on my radar, and I haven't wanted to sort of bring them all in together, because that would have meant that we'd have had to have focused in future years on the people who are on my kind of B list. But Tim is absolutely on my A list, and really, really pleased that he's here. I'm sure you know some of the things that Tim has written about and researched over the years. I know him best, I guess, from the first thing that I came across of his, which was the Tourists of the Taj book, which was it your PhD? Or
it was a PhD, yeah. Yeah,
PhD research. And then the book that beautiful book on ruins, which I recommend to all my students, and many of them I'm sure will have read. So it's a kind of related thing tonight, I guess, and this is a current project that Tim is working on in his role at Manchester Metropolitan University, but also now with a visiting position at Melbourne as well, on the Stony stories of Melbourne. As I say, Tim is at Manchester Met. He also has this role in Melbourne as well, and he's sort of balancing those two things at the moment and maybe rethinking that balance.
Yes, that's fair to say.
Not in favour of Manchester, I'm sorry to say. Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. It's great to be here in this fantastic setting as well, apart from this strange noise that's coursing through the radiators. But that won't put me off. So yeah, as John said, I kind of did quite a lot of work on industrial ruins. I got a small grant to drive up and down the length and breadth of Britain, looking for old abandoned factories, warehouses, mills, foundries. And I had a blast, I've got to say. It was a fantastic time, and I enjoyed it very much. And one of the key themes that emerged out of that was a kind of enduring preoccupation with materiality. And one of the things about walking around ruins is you have a much more kind of, I suppose, an immediate sensory engagement with matter of all sorts. Matter that spills out from behind the walls, the kind of things that make up the building as it starts to decay, but also all sorts of strange objects that you have no idea what they are, things that have emerged from the industrial process. So this kind of interest in ruins has subsequently led to a fascination with stone, with building stone. Now, I could look at lots of building materials, but here I want to focus on stone. And having been in Melbourne for 8 months earlier in the year, I've become very interested in Melbourne's stone. So I want to talk a little bit about that. The plan is to write a sort of book-length project on this. So I'm kind of at the start, but I've been doing a little bit of research. So bear with me, some of this is a little bit formative, but it also recycles some work that I've done previously in Manchester, which I'll mention in a bit. Okay, so the first thing that I want to say is that one of the things about stone, as with kind of nearly all bits of stuff or matter that we find in the city, is that they kind of reveal how cities are always composed out of bits, most of which come from somewhere else, at least very rarely they come from the immediate vicinity anyway of the building that's produced. So along with flows of people, information and money, materials constitute cities. And these cities, of course, and the materials in them are continuously assembled and reassembled in changing configurations. This is completely kind of ongoing. And as geographer Robert Sapp claims, strands from places are woven and rewoven to become elements in yet other places. So I'm kind of really interested in this kind of circulation of stuff that goes on all the time. And so architecture, the architecture of most cities, especially now, contemporary cities, is materially constitutive of other places. And what's interesting about this then is when we kind of look at buildings and we look at the sort of material fabric of the city, in generally speaking, the relations between the sites of construction and the sites of supply are usually quite precarious. They're only stable for various durations. And those relationships between places of supply and construction often drift into obsolescence as they become superseded by new arrangements with other places. And so material networks, the material networks that exist, might in some way, I guess, stabilize a place for a while, but other times these kind of relationships and forms of supply, these networks of supply, can be really volatile, i.e. in the present day, as I'll say a little bit more about. So, you all know this as archaeologists, but to say that, to emphasise that the city then is never, ever, ever a stable thing, a solid thing, but it continuously comes into being through the dynamic material flows of matter from elsewhere, amongst other things that I'll go on to say. And so as far as these building materials are concerned, and here I'm going to want to talk about stone, the supply chains, the supply networks, might be provoked into coming into being by a whole range of factors. And these might include architectural fashion, different kinds of style, the kind of aesthetic qualities of the material, you know, that aesthetic quality becomes fashionable for a while. Or it might be more practical, like its durable hardness, or the extent to which it can be carved. Of course, techniques are kind of really interesting here. What kind of techniques can be deployed to kind of produce particular shapes and forms? The cost, of course, is kind of important. The ways in which quarrying material can be quarried, whether that material is kind of accessible for quarrying. Technologies of transport are really important. Technologies of masonry and quarrying. And of course, there's all sorts of social connections, the kind of deals that might be made, or maybe sometimes backhand deals between people who want to import material and those who want to supply it. Also depends on things like labour supply and how much of this resource exists, how much stone is there at a particular place. So it's really critical then, just to emphasise, that buildings and their materials emerge out of the relations between places of construction and supply. And so they therefore, all buildings of any age at all, act as a testament to forgotten connections between places. I kind of think this is really, really interesting historically to track back how these relations have come into being and then disappeared. But what I also want to talk about a little bit is, which seems to me to be quite important, is to think about the sort of sensory and affective qualities of stone. Okay, so what does it do? How does it make us feel? The phenomenological impact of living with it and working with it, and the kind of material agency of the stone itself. What particular kinds of stone afford particular sensations, particular impressions, feelings, atmospheres, and how this actually might change with the different uses and technological developments. And I think these qualities, these affective and sensory qualities of place, I mean, I shouldn't need to say this if you look out the window here, but they add profoundly to generating a sense of place. But it does, of course, doesn't have to be kind of, you know, a venerable stone such as we see here. So stone is a material that engages the senses in quite a profound way, I think, through visual apprehension. Think about the way the thing looks, but also think about the way it sounds when you hit it. But also think about the tactile engagement. I mean, I kind of think that tactility is kind of really important as well. So think about how that might contribute. A sense of play to a sense of place. Think about feeling the weight, surface, and hardness of different kinds of stone. And the kind of senses that are provoked by the everyday stones and brick environments in which we live. And I'm sure you can all immediately conjure this up if you think about your own, you know, your own house, your neighbourhood, your back alleys, and so forth. And so the material affordances and environments and agencies of stone mesh with the human sensorium and emotion. And importantly, this of course also includes those who work with stone, the quarry workers, the transporters and the masons, who kind of work quite intimately with this material. Okay. The affordances of stone also mesh with the kind of agencies that attack it or interact with it, and I'll say something about a bit more about that. So in previous work, some of you may have come across work that I've written about the building stone of Manchester, and particularly a church in the centre of Manchester, St Anne's Church, which some of you will know, I'm sure. And it's really interesting, this church, because it's a composite of stone from numerous sources. And it originated 300 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, and of course in those times people used local stone. So this building was built, this church was built out of local stone from a quarry that was closed down 200 years ago. And the stone wasn't very good, especially when Manchester got all toxic, when the air got all vile. It eroded very quickly. And so, but luckily, as this happened, first canal networks and railway networks were opened. And so different qualities of stone could be imported into the city centre. So if you want to read the paper, I can send you that if you get in touch with me. However, I've become fascinated by the stone of a different city, Melbourne. And in most cases, but not all cases, that stone is of, or at least the buildings that I'm going to talk about are not quite as old. So I want to talk about different stories then, about how stone has circulated, disappeared, and mutated and changed in Melbourne, and how this powerfully contributes to the century and effective qualities of the city. Okay, so the first thing I need to talk about, and you always have to do this in Australia, quite rightly, is to think about pre-European settlement. That's critical, okay? So this is a greenstone implement here. And so what we're talking about here then are Aboriginal circulations of stone. And it comes from, but not very far away from Melbourne, from a mountain called Mount William, where extensive quarries still exist. But and if you go to Mount William, you can see the whole, an array of stone that has been kind of mined, this greenstone. And what's interesting is that there's incredibly extensive circulation of these stones that were used for tools for hundreds of kilometres from the quarry, including throughout the whole southeast, so that these stones were circulated through Melbourne. There it is, there's the quarry. And as Isabel McBride has written, long-distance exchange and social and ceremonial linkages are still, and certainly were, a feature of Aboriginal life, with Australia covered by a matrix of such networks. So the circulations that I'm talking about aren't only modern, okay? So the circulations, this interaction between material is an ongoing thing. And so goods like greenstone, this greenstone here, moved along these routes towards nodes of exchange and meeting centres, where groups came together for social, political, ritual events. So they're kind of quite ancient, these, and they coexist with the other stone networks established since the 19th century. But what I've particularly found out, I haven't been able to find this yet, but I will, is a sharpening rock. So this isn't greenstone, this is a particular kind of sandstone that affords the ability to sharpen the greenstone. So the greenstones would have been mined, quarried at Mount William, and then taken to a mountain that was about 20 miles away, called Mount Macedon, and sharpened. And what I kind of like about this is, it shows how kind of stone moves through different kind of processes: quarrying, shaping, manufacture, and then circulation. But what I also like about this is I kind of think it comes from, at least this is another sharpening rock, not the one in Mount Macedon that I've yet to find. But what I like about this is I kind of think, I'm hoping all of you looking at this can imagine the sensuous engagement of using a bit of greenstone and moving it through these kind of grooves. Just imagine what that feels like. And I kind of again, to sort of undergird what I want to say about the kind of effective and sensory qualities of stone, which I think we need to honour, and we need to acknowledge how that works. Okay, so that's the first thing that I want to talk about. That's the first story. I'll find more strands to this story, I think, as I carry out more research. But in order to talk about Melbourne, the first stone I have to talk about is this stuff here, which is bluestone. Now, initially, Melbourne wasn't discovered by Europeans till 1838, so it's really recent, or 1837, it's really recent. This is a really recent city. And there's this statistic, which I kind of find very hard to believe, But they say that in 1838 there were 700 cattle in and around Melbourne, and in 1839 there were 500,000 cattle in and around Melbourne. So we're talking about a massive transformation of this site that was occupied, a crossing point for many Aborigines, but very, very rapidly became colonised and built and constructed with agriculture to start with, and then very, very rapidly the city emerged and was built because it was located in a fantastic harbour, fantastically sheltered harbour. And so to start with then, they wanted to, of course, in order to create buildings, there was a local building that was in very plentiful supply. And it's this stuff here. It's called Bluestone. And it was initially used as a base and material for industrial and ecclesiastical buildings. Churches used it quite happily. And so many, many older non-prestigious buildings made out of bluestone remain. It's incredibly durable. It's basalt. It's rock hard. It won't kind of erode rapidly at all. And so it extends across the Victorian basalt plain. And in the city, it was quarried. So in Melbourne itself, there were lots of bluestone quarries in a place called Merry Creek, at Williamston and at Footscray. And there's loads of sites of bluestone quarrying in this wider Melbourne region. So as I say, ecclesiastical industrial buildings, in this building here, which is a kind of notorious 19th century prison, Pentridge prison. And so in the Merry Creek, as I've just mentioned, in 1875, there were 41 quarries in Merry Creek, which is where the river River Yarra flows through the city, and 41 quarries, including the very deep bluestone Wales quarry in Brunswick, which I've kind of featured here. And it closed in the 1960s, and I'll say a little bit more about that. And it's now, like many pits, ex-quarries in the city, have been turned into parks. So if you come across a park in Melbourne, the likelihood is it once was a quarry. And what's kind of really interesting here, that what I kind of want to sort of flag up here is that then, so what did this get filled with? And the answer is that these quarries got filled with stone, again, from the buildings that were demolished in Melbourne. So Melbourne's been incredibly, especially over the 20th century, there's been this incredibly volatile period, these incredibly volatile periods of demolition and reconstruction. So very good buildings, buildings that we certainly wouldn't demolish now, we would regard as of heritage value, were demolished. But what's kind of interesting is that a lot of the rock that was taken out of this ground, the stone that was taken out, was then put back. It filled in these big gaps once people ceased to quarry within the city centre. So there's a story here about how successive building has been accompanied by ongoing demolition, with many fine buildings lost. It's kind of really important, I think, that circulation also includes not merely, often stone might be recycled, but more often in Melbourne's case, it's just chucked back into the ground, useless. And here, this notorious figure here, can you see this? They all talk about this, all Melburnians always talk about this. Whelan the Wrecker is here. So here's Whelan the Wrecker, this kind of famous demolition company that could have swayed through Melbourne's buildings throughout. It started in the kind of 19th century and throughout most of the 20th century. So Whelan the Wrecker is a kind of a symbol of the kind of mass destruction of this kind of very vital and very kind of vibrant city, and the way in which the stone was returned to the ground, if you like. So the big quarried holes, you can imagine, these big quarried holes provided ideal sites for disposal. Now, what's kind of interesting about the bluestone, which is everywhere, so you can see it in the curbs, you can see it in the gutters here, the curbstones, the gutters, and there are these kind of laneways in Melbourne that you see that are kind of everywhere. In central Melbourne, they're all composed out of this bluestone as well, and it's, as you can imagine, it's really hard to work with this stuff. This is not a soft sandstone, And to start with, as you might have guessed, much of this stone was worked by convicts. And so as you walk through the city, you can see these marks that were created by convicts. Sometimes you can see kind of initials and marks that they left as testament to their kind of presence. So it's kind of there. But I'm kind of interested in what this felt like as well. And so I'll just draw a parallel here with a sculptor, David Patton's work, who has written about how he used to work with sandstone, a much softer material, and then he worked with granite. And he continues to work with granite. And this is what he says. He says, the sweet thud of impact that to some would seem impossibly hard, to the mason is a fluid bodily motion. Muscle readily accustomed to this activity flexes without complaint, the granite accommodating an impact that on other stones would render it useless, bruised, or even shattered. And I kind of like this, because it highlights the absolute distinction between different kinds of stone and what it feels like to work with them, and how you become differently skilled at working with different stones. But of course, that also conjures up the sensory and affective qualities of bluestone. So too does its impact upon place, and here is one of the laneways that I'm talking about. And you can see here how this very dark rock, this dark, durable, hard rock, absorbs light. So it absorbs light, it adds a certain blackness, a gloom to these kind of alleyways, just through its kind of colour. And of course, except when it rains, when it kind of shines. Okay, very vibrantly, as well as absorb moisture like a lot of sedimentary rock, right? So it kind of adds very strongly, and people have become very, as I'll say, become very kind of precious about this bluestone. It's really important to Melbourne. It's a signature of what Melbourne is and what it represents. So it adds a very, very powerful, distinct sense of place, I would say. But apart from, because of its unmalleability, it's largely unmalleable, right, this stuff. It's hard to kind of carve out of, as you can see, fine for making square blocks, but to actually carve finely out of is impossible. Except for a particular stone from Malmesbury. So it's not quite as simple as saying all bluestone is like this. One form of bluestone, Malmesbury, can be carved a little bit, but largely, sorry, I didn't want to show you that yet. Largely, it wasn't considered suitable for other public and commercial buildings. It's tough, it's hard, but it's not. You can't work in any fine way with it. Now, what's kind of really interesting now, this is what I kind of find interesting, is that new techniques, machine techniques, cutting techniques, can now mold bluestone in beautiful and incredible ways, retexturing it, creating smooth surfaces in a way that hammer and chisel never could. So contemporary cutting techniques have rendered the material smooth in contradistinction to the rugged textures of earlier buildings. And so what's happened, especially in the kind of latter half of the 20th century, and especially in more recent times, is that rather than being considered as a low-grade material suitable for industrial buildings and pavements and alleyways, as it's now got a real cachet as a very cool material with which to create buildings with. And so, for instance, here's a building made out of bluestone. Could never have been done before. Impossible to create a building like this in the past. But as you can see, it's a sheeny, smooth surface. And this is a library in Williamstown. And this is a sleek private residence. So it's kind of interesting the way in which the stone has been completely revalued due to the sort of advent of new forms of technology. And in addition to this kind of revaluing of the stone, it's been completely kind of reconstituted as a very, very chic building material, obviously in kind of very thin veneers now, not quite big blocks. But in addition to that, it's also been revalued as part of Melbourne's heritage. So it has an incredible heritage cachet now that it never would have done before. Formerly, so it's kind of interesting the way in which was formerly discredited and almost kind of vilified is now almost the opposite of that. It's seen as the kind of, the king of Melbourne stone, if you want. And if you want to kind of remove any of the cobbles from the alleyway that I just showed you, then you've got to make sure that you put them back exactly as they were. There's no removal here, not allowed at all. Okay. But as I just mentioned, Bluestone was unsuited to very prestigious carved buildings, large and prestigious buildings, especially in the 19th century, that were, of course, influenced by kind of British aesthetics and architectural aesthetics and trends at the time. So Melbourne's civic buildings, like the ones that we find here, tended to be elaborately carved in neoclassical or Gothic designs. And so what you need sandstone. Bluestone can't be used for this at all. So you need sandstone. Now, to start with, of course, since the colony, the town was established by the British, as you might imagine, the first sources of sandstone came from intercolonial networks. So the first stone supply of sandstone for the city's buildings came from Tasmania and New Zealand. And then later on, as transport networks improved a little bit, sandstone was imported from near Sydney to build these kind of prestigious buildings, banks, courts, civic buildings and so forth. And then the Victorian Parliament decreed that there would be a £100 reward if anybody could find a suitable source of sandstone that was more locally available, or at least in Victoria. Now, before I kind of go on to tell you what happened, local sandstone was used for some buildings, but it was really inferior. And I want to just go off at a little tangent here and talk about this building, which was actually built in the 1920s. So you see, it's quite a striking building. And it's Newman College at the University of Melbourne. But this is Barrabool sandstone, not very far from Melbourne, and it was used for quite a few other buildings as well. Well, I'll put this up here because it's kind of interesting in terms of what happened to it. And so this Barrabool sandstone was not very well suited. So even though it was built, this building was built in the 1920s, in this very striking design, it very, very gradually dissolved and fell apart very, very quickly. So the stone suffered after it left its kind of beds, quarry, came to Melbourne, and these reasons are many. So why this suffered, why this building started to fall apart, was due to human decisions, but also to the multiple agencies that swirl around any local environment. And this started to happen. As you can see, the stone started to laminate quite badly, quite rapidly on this college. So a lot of this was kind of the fault of humans, bad building and repair techniques. So they used impervious mortar. Stone, especially sandstone, is porous material. Water has to come through it, has to go through it. If you put impervious mortar in it, it stops that flow through stones. And it collects, water collects and starts to erode the stone. Different stones were put next to Barrabool sandstone that were far more porous or were less porous, and so these things didn't sit well together in terms of the flow of water. There were certain areas where water might pool and collect, little niches and so forth. Water then further attacked the stone. Then rather stupidly, you may have heard of this, and this was a kind of wide technique in the 60s, is people started to set, if buildings start to show signs of distress or discolouring, that people would sandblast them. They'd sandblast them so they looked smooth again, which was a disastrous thing to do because it removed the protective skin of the stone, thus rendering it much more susceptible to erosion. But it's not only these human errors that we can point to. There's all sorts of non-human factors that come into play. To start with, of course, there's acid rain, or what we might call airborne pollutants, that kind of attack the stone. In the city, the carbon monoxide and the other chemicals that are released from factories, sulphur. Another interesting thing that happens here is the salt within stone. And which might have been perfectly fine for a long time, but if water penetrates, salt migrates and moves. And this can even happen in buildings where there's a salt deposit underneath the building. Water gets down, the salt rises up and penetrates the building. It erodes it very quickly. It can also be eroded by biofilms. Really what I mean by biofilms, so that is the kind of green stuff that you see on stone, on old stone. But it's all right for a while, but if you leave it long enough, it'll start to sound they're usually kind of complex consortia of different organisms. It's not like one organism, but certain of those organisms send filaments into the stone, and suddenly, after being quite stable for a while, it can be rapidly eroded. There might be small earthquakes, small tremors that kind of shift stones around. And then another kind of key thing that happens is that sometimes in the old days they used to kind of put iron staples or bars underneath the stone to kind of keep it in place as an added strengthening device. But again, if that gets wet, the iron expands and the stone cracks. So the issue here then is that what I kind of want to foreground is that all buildings, and I mean this building in particular tells this story, of all these agencies that continually transform it. And not only that, but they also disclose the numerous interventions at different periods that have been attempted by people to ameliorate these efforts. So if we look at a building, we see the history of the different agencies that have led to its kind of erosion. And then we can also see the numerous interventions that have taken place to keep these things at bay or to repair the effects of these processes. Because no buildings last forever, right? And so and I kind of think this is really important. This is just more broadly, a broader point here across the social sciences, is that we really neglect active maintenance. Is that without maintenance, everything would fall apart very, very quickly. There's a really interesting book called The World Without Us by Alan Weissman. It's just a non-fiction book, it's not an academic book, but it talks about what would happen if human life was suddenly extinguished in New York City, and very quickly it would devolve into nothing. What's that film with Will Smith? You know, he enters this kind of post-apocalyptic landscape, which is kind of New York.
I Am Legend.
I Am Legend, that's it, thank you, I Am Legend. I Am Legend, the scenario of I Am Legend would prevail very, very quickly. And so maintenance is not honoured enough. But without maintenance in this room, without kind of, hoovering, detritus would gather, plants would start to grow, water would ingress into the building, into the windows and so forth. So things fall apart very quickly. And it's those acts of maintenance that are absolutely critical. And so we can track those acts of maintenance in buildings. But what this also shows, and I'm kind of going back to the work that I did earlier about ruins, is that actually we tend to fetishize ruins. We tend to talk about certain buildings as ruins and as other buildings as not ruins, but everything is an incipient ruin. And anything that isn't cared for through maintenance and repair will become a ruin very, very rapidly. So it's kind of interesting that maintenance always keeps ruination at bay. And the final thing I'll just say about that is that also depends upon how we value a building. So certain buildings are allowed to decay or not cared for, other buildings are valued more highly and are intensively repaired and maintained at all times. Okay, so back to the sandstone. So after searching, as people wanted to get this $100 or £100 reward, after much searching, they found it. And here it is. A very, very good quality sandstone started to be quarried at Heatherley Quarry, which is in the Grampians, which is about 100, maybe a bit longer than 100 miles away from Melbourne. And in 1880, though, just as this had been discovered, a decision had been made to source the stone for the new Parliament building from New South Wales. Not from here, but from New South Wales, from near Sydney. Because it was too expensive to transport the stone to Melbourne from this site. It was just too costly and too difficult. They only had bullock carts available at that time to transport it. And so there was a bit of an uproar about that. And there's the quarry again. which is now obviously kind of long deserted. And a Member of Parliament, John Woods, who was the MP for a site adjacent to the quarry in the Victorian part, expressed his indignation at the choice of this New South Wales. So this was wrong. This was inappropriate. To build a parliament in Melbourne, it must surely be composed out of Melbourne stone. And there it is. So there is this pillar. It's right in the centre. Not anybody notices this. So it's right in the Central Park in Melbourne. There's this big pillar of this stone, and this is what he claimed. He was outraged that this was going to happen. So he erected this 4-metre high pillar next to the Royal Exhibition Centre to prove how durable it was. And he said it would outlast the building, the exhibition centre that was there. And so he banged on so vociferously, and the campaign was so profound, that in the end they created a tramway from Heatherley Quarry, which enabled them to transport the stone, which reduced the cost of transport, and they agreed that this would eventuate. There it is, the Parliament building composed entirely of Heatherley Quarry stone. It's really good stone. And many buildings were subsequently made from this in Melbourne. So there's a lot of this stuff in Melbourne, like the Town Hall there, for instance, as well. This, again, I kind of want to think a little bit about what it was like to work there. I mean, when I went, it was boiling hot to take these photographs. The fly, absolutely riven with flies. And it was hard to engage with the stone. So there's the stone. There are the kind of testaments to the kind of previous quarry. So first, it would have been hot, difficult to work with, and it would have had to be laboriously laden onto a bullock cart and taken to the local train station. And here it was split through plug and feathering techniques. You can kind of see this here. So holes would be drilled along the grain, filled with plugs, and then struck along the line until the stone splits. And then later, of course, explosives. And so maybe you can get a sense of this from looking at this, how difficult and how it would have been. And even though it's really hard stone, this really good stone, could be carved beautifully, masons complained that it was full of flints. And so not that easy to work with, actually, although easier than bluestone. Okay, so this then became very successful. The quarry's not used any longer, but a lot of Melbourne's buildings were built out of this proudly Victorian sandstone. Okay, so then the next thing that I need to say, of course, which is kind of important, is that the 1950s and 60s came along after I'm not going into that yet. After World War II, modernism emerged. And the era of concrete, glass and steel came to pass. And there was also, consequentially, as I've already explained, through Weed and the Wrecker and other demolition companies, much demolition of stone building. So it started to be kind of eroded. And stone building was kind of very minimal. And so connections to the previous sites of stone supply were curtailed. They kind of seized all these quarries that had been working, maybe not as much as they had done, but then after World War II, they kind of seized as glass and concrete became important. But as we all know, subsequently, there has been widespread disillusion with modernism. And stone has become really, really popular again. Massively popular again. Now, it's true, stone hasn't been used in the same way. It's primarily used as cladding and flooring and used for the columns of building and so forth. So often the stone that you see on the building will only be very thin. But it doesn't look like it, it looks solid. You'll think it was solid. So huge quantities of often high quality building stone are now shipped into Melbourne from far-flung locations, ignoring all these supplies that are actually quite close to hand and that used to be important. And of course, this is all on the grounds of cost. But we might really want to question the environmental impact of transporting these supplies. and I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. But the carbon footprint of this is kind of quite profound, and also bear in mind the kind of social and labour conditions that pertain in the places where the stone is quarried. So most stone now in most big cities derive from a plethora of global sources. We aren't talking about these kind of local or even regional supplies anymore. And often these are kind of super quarries, giant quarries. So the distribution of quarries has changed. And right across small town Victoria, there's lots of disused quarries. So just to give you an example, so these are buildings that have been built from the 1980s and 90s. So here is the Southgate Towers, built in 1992. There's the Yarra River, the waterfront, quite a prestigious location. And that's built, this stone here, this red stuff, is red granite from Finland. But it was processed in Italy, carved, quarried in Finland, taken to Italy, dressed, and then shipped. Here is 101 Collins Street, probably Melbourne's richest, most prestigious street. And here, there's two types of granite you can see here, the grey and the white. The grey comes from Spain, the white comes from Zimbabwe. And here's just a few doors down, 120 Collins Street. The granite, it's a facade of granite from Italy and Scandinavia. Okay, so we can see these kind of dramatic transformations in the way, in the material composition of the city and the connections that it has with other places. Okay, so I want to make some sort of concluding points. One thing that's kind of really important to say, and I've already mentioned this, is that the face of a building, and therefore of the stone in it that it's composed of, depends upon the shifting values that esteem a building or regard it as ugly, useless, or outmoded. And as I've said, these earlier stone buildings were seen as ugly, useless, and outmoded, impractical, inflexible things. And so Melbourne's lost, people lament this now, but it's too late. Architects and heritage bodies lament the loss of these older buildings. I mean, they're amazing. As you see photographs of them, these extraordinary, huge buildings, which would now, as I've said, be definitely listed, I'm sure. And it's kind of interesting, I think, then, that this kind of shows how buildings are always under threat. I've already said from a range of different forces, but these range of forces may render them subject to erasure or neglect. And as Jeremy Till has observed, all forms of architecture can be conceived as mere waste in transit. And we might see how, especially in the 20th century, maybe now too, not necessarily here, but in other parts, the sort of capitalist tendencies towards what Schumpeter famously calls creative destruction take place. So the obliteration of economic orders and older modes of production and older modes of building, older structures, to clear the way for the creation of new wealth, new architectural fashions, and changing aesthetics. We can see how this takes place and has taken place to shape the architectural legacies and the very materiality of the city. But in another way, I think I want to say that what I've tried to show is through all the different agencies that swirl around the building, human and non-human, is that this endless change, this endless mutability, brings into question, I think, ideas about heritage value. Because usually, I think, I would argue that most forms of preservation attempt to freeze the past by fixing the materiality of a structure. They arrest decay. They try to at least provide the illusion of arresting the processes that lead to the endless changing here of stone. And so what I kind of quite like about the buildings that I've talked about, and some of the stories that I think are really interesting here, is that we can acknowledge actually the unfixity of these forms of heritage. We can acknowledge how things move and mutate all the time, how all matter is kind of on the move and shifts in accordance with all these different agencies and its own qualities. maybe in some sense then there's a danger of fixing the past, and that perhaps we could think about forms of heritage that involve a more sustained acceptance of these forms of endless transformation. So in other words, one way is to think about buildings as events or as processes rather than things that we should endlessly preserve and try to fix, as though these decisions were made in 1975, and we have to preserve a building as it was in 1975 when those decisions were made. So I think these are kind of really, it raises these sorts of questions. The other thing that's kind of really obvious that I've already mentioned is I think we need to take more seriously the carbon footprint and insanity of importing stone from across the world, especially when similar material is nearly always available locally. Can this be sustainable? But as with other processes, this is connected to the way corporatisation of capital, and the collapse and the absorption of smaller entities into bigger entities, is that there's been a continual reduction in number of quarries since before the start of the Industrial Revolution, I guess. And you can see this. I mean, we all know this, right? If we go around any village in Britain, any old village, and anything built before the advent of modern transport will have come from very local sources. These local quarries are just everywhere, and they might be hard to identify now, but these shallows in the ground, little bits of escarpments that are kind of uneven. They're everywhere. And so, I mean, I think I'm kind of conflicted about this, is that on the one hand, we don't want to be kind of parochial, but on the other hand, maybe there's cause to call for a kind of reconfigured critical regionalism, as Kenneth Frampton called it, over 20 years ago now, where the relations of a place to its region, its neighbouring surroundings, are restored. And perhaps this kind of importation of stuff from elsewhere, and I mean stone's only one example of this, of course, it creates a certain kind of placelessness. These stones can come from anywhere. They come out of catalogues that are sent around by global suppliers. It's like a huge kind of selection of palette and texture. And so perhaps we need to think about how we might restore the link between cities and earlier sites of stone supply. Maybe that's a form of heritage, a kind of active form of heritage that we might want to consider. But I have to say that on the other hand, for architects and for planners and for designers, the ability to choose stone from the world, the multiplicity of sources, of course, does allow them to play with a much greater sort of variety of colour and texture. So it's a kind of an interesting question, but I think it's a serious and important question. And final thing that I want to say is that in understanding how the city has emerged and continues to emerge, I kind of think what's really important is that we honour those who've laboured in continually remaking it. We forget about them all the time. The quarrymen, in terms of what I'm talking about, the quarrymen, the transporters, the labourers, the masons. In other words, not just the bloody architects. Right? We fetishise the architects. This building has been built by a particular architect. Yeah, okay, honour them, but we kind of forget them. And I think in so doing, if we kind of acknowledge these other people, we can also kind of solicit, I suppose, a more tactile understanding of heritage that considers how people engaged with matter in a kind of an empathetic way, get engaged with matter like stone, so to produce this kind of sensory empathy that involves a fuller appreciation, I think, of the affordances of matter, the stuff that we kind of live amongst. And then this also then, I think, helps us think about how stone contributes much more than simply a material, functional materiality to the structure of the buildings and the streets that we live in, but it adds an aesthetic, sensory and historical identity, which we're kind of invariably entangled with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. much, Tim. And some of the things you were talking about this evening lead us very neatly into Caitlin's talk next week.
I think so, yeah.
As well. So we have time for some questions. Go on.
I'll start off. I'm intrigued by the notion of the relationship between materiality and the sense of place. And whether you think that the Melbourne of the 1950s, 60s, there's a different sense of place to how people feel about Melbourne now, whether that relates to the physicality, materiality of it, and are people aware where the stone comes from? So people who live in and walk past it, but does it not matter? So is the sense of place actually just about, we've got skyscrapers now, where we didn't have before? Or is it bound up in more of the materiality?
I mean, it's a great question, but I think, I mean, the other thing is, I mean, maybe they don't know where it comes from. Of course, some people will know where it comes from. There'll be a shared, I guess, a kind of a shared folk knowledge that amongst some people, which will live, which will kind of persist. But I think the thing that I kind of point to more is the kind of feel and the texture and the sensory impress of the stone. As you kind of, like, so for instance, if you go to Aberdeen or Bath, which are cities, they're kind of unusual cities, but they're composed out of one kind of stone. So, you know, everyone knows Aberdeen is the granite city. And by God, when you're in Aberdeen, you know you're in a granite city. The sort of impress of the buildings is kind of quite profound upon you. And likewise in Bath, you've got this kind of mellow, sort of yellowish stone everywhere. You know, I mean, you know, these are kind of very difficult things to articulate, aren't they? So they're kind of hard to capture. But if, you know, in these kind of very obvious examples, these are kind of quite easy to get at. I think the other thing as well, though, is that we also need to look at the kind of form of architecture as well. So a lot of these buildings, they're kind of rooted in community, you know, they're civic, they're kind of religious. Whereas now, of course, I mean, the examples that I showed, they're gigantic corporate monoliths. And there's a sense then in which then they're all about kind of impression and spectacle. And that kind of, that's almost sort of configured in the very material form of them, I think, as well. So, and the way in which they feel in compared to these older Stony buildings, I think is kind of quite profoundly different. So, I mean, I think we're going to be, obviously, like, I'm wary of trying to sound parochial and everything, you know, we must go back to the past. And, you know, then that could bring in kind of really unpleasant, kind of recursive, defensive notions about, you know, what belongs where, and then that could all too dangerously move into kind of who belongs where. So, I mean, these debates are kind of really difficult, I think, but I still think they should be kind of raised in terms of thinking about the identity of a city and its history and its heritage and its kind of, you know, through its kind of material composition.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that, Ron? As a Melbourneian, I mean, you know, I think, you know, from the kind of 50s and 60s, Melbourne had just had the Olympics. It was obsessed with being an outward-focused world city, and it was, the past wasn't much like York, actually, in Stony. It wasn't looking at the past, it was looking at the future, about a global identity. And you really see that reflected in the buildings and the materials they're using. And today we've now got this dichotomy between being this world city of skyscrapers built with Zimbabwean stone, but also the cachet of heritage that you know, is again the same here. And for me, Bluestone means old Melbourne. And if you saw a Bluestone building, you knew you were in Victoria. Yeah. And you know, particularly going out into the small towns of Victoria, they're all Bluestone, and it's such a strong link to the historic fabric of the towns and cities. And it's interesting to compare those with the skyscrapers on Collins Street, which could be anywhere. And looking up, you could be an American city, whereas look down and you suddenly see St. Francis's Church, and it's a little Bluestone Gothic building. And suddenly you instantly know you're in Melbourne again. And I think that's a really interesting kind of dichotomy in Melbourne, and this desire between nationalistic, this is Melbourne, versus, oh, we want to be a big boy on the world stage and we need big tall skyscrapers, even though we've got an enormous city. and we don't actually need to build up because we can build out.
Yeah.
But there's not as much prestige in building out as there is in building up.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, no.
Thinking about the materials and what they mean.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. You put that really well. I mean, it has become really a cachet, hasn't it, Bluestone? In a way it wasn't before, but now it's almost fetishised, I think you could argue, by certain communities.
Yeah.
I have a question about people, and is there any evidence, particularly on these heritage bluestone buildings, of masons' marks and people sort of later, obviously referred to the convicts made marks, but any in that sort of later wave of European settlement when people were going out for opportunity and skills, of marks that were made on buildings in Europe, England particularly, and then seeing those people move out there and taking their skills and leaving their mark in buildings in Australia? Is there any opportunity?
I mean, I know people always talk about the convicts. Again, that's kind of part of the way in which people talk about Bluestone in Melbourne. Look, we have this past that's kind of in because it's so hard, these things kind of persist. So there are, of course, nearly everywhere, everything has a mason's mark, and you can track those things down. Obviously, they're kind of overlooked a lot of the time, but you don't have to look very hard to find these things. But I want to give you a different example, which is something I only just found out about, which is, it's an amazing thing, this. I was amazed. So, as you might know, to Melbourne, loads of Scottish people migrated. Right, it was a real place for kind of Scottish migration, and they were always complicit with the empire, as we all know. And so thousands of Scots went out there. And they went out quite early on, they went out in sort of 1840, 1850. And then there's sort of north of the city, there's the Scott Cemetery. It's a run-down cemetery now. Not many people know about it. It's been kind of left to sort of decay a little bit. And if you go to the cemetery, you'll see these kind of gravestones built of sandstone, made of sandstone, which are kind of decaying a little bit. Except for the huge red granite sandstone, gravestone, which was bought over in 1860, I think, by a migrant from Aberdeen. And not only did he came over to where he knew he wasn't ever going to go back to Scotland, he bought his gravestone with him. And so there it is, proudly.
Yeah, Jill, we'll go to Jill and then Dan. Jill first.
I was interested in your idea about the paradox of fixity and preservation or conservation. And I'm just wondering how you might be thinking about that. I mean, if you work in conservation, you know there's absolutely no such thing. You can maybe stabilise something for a very short period, but actually all buildings are constantly in flux and needing to be renewed. So we never really fix them. I guess what you're talking about more is the sense in which it inhibits innovation or significant change in a particular spot. I was just wondering whether you had thought about how you might bring more fluidity, more flux, more interesting change within the parameters of us being so concerned about the character of our historic places and that local distinctiveness that we all value so much.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think it's really. I mean, the things that I would say would sort of be offensive to sort of many conservation folk. I think. I mean, I would like to see, for instance, where an old carving erodes and there's very little left of it. I'd like to see somebody put a new carving there, contemporary carving. Yeah, exactly. So those sorts of things, I think, are really possible. Alternatively, you could put a very different kind of stone there. That kind of heralds the fact that there was something there before, rather than pretending that, because in a few years, I mean, I think, with the passage of time, things blend, whereas this would kind of reveal that actually this is a building that has been kind of being transformed. And you put a different, I mean, that's what they've done in St Anne's Church in Manchester, the church there, and that was inadvertently, because the building was covered in soot. So they didn't know what colour it was, it didn't really matter. They just needed to stabilise, stop it falling apart. So I think that's one other possibility, kind of, inventive things. The other thing you'll hear about next week from Caitlin, where she thinks there should be kind of managed decay. She talks about just let things fall apart, let them go, or maybe, in buildings, let certain bits of the building fall apart to honour the kind of process of time. And also, there's this kind of idea of you know, patina or patina. What if there's this kind of endless replacement of stone, then the actual age of the building becomes obscure, or it appears obscure. So I think there's a multiplicity of different kind of approaches to this. You know, I do think it would help to kind of question this simple substitution of what was believed to be there before. I think that might be more productive to think about that more creatively and have you know, maybe more have a whole range of different strategies for dealing with that. There's no answer. I don't think there's a single thing. Although I wouldn't want to kind of put forward a single approach. Duff?
I just want to ask a bit about the connection between quarries and the CBD and the building. And obviously, historically in the UK, stone was moved primarily by water. But by the 19th century England, we had canals and railways and a very well-established transport network, which obviously Melbourne didn't have at that period. And you mentioned the tramway from Stony to Grantham. That were they still using water primarily as the transport network? I mean, from Merry Creek, were they heading it onto the Yarra and taking it up?
Yeah. Where was I now? Was it Phillip Island? I was at Phillip Island. There was this huge, I can't remember what it was called, the Royal something building. So, there are kind of fragments of this in the Carlton Gardens in the centre of Melbourne. They've kept it, and this building was there's a small quarry on Phillip Island. You can see there's loads of blocks there, and that was bought by water. That was it's an island on that lies in the bay, and it was kind of brought around and into the to the docks at Melbourne. So that was transported by water. And that was the one that, this is really old, I'm going to just say something about this. So it was built out of this very sturdy granite, and Wheeling the Wrecker tried to knock it down. It took them a year. It was a ridiculous project. They should never have bothered. They lost thousands and thousands of pounds knocking this down because it was so superbly built and so sturdy. But they just, once they started, it was one of the things we started, they had to finish it. And they lost that. But it was a ridiculous thing and an amazing building. And then people lamented it. And so now, you know, there are kind of two vestiges of that. One, these kind of big blocks of carved granite that lie in Carlton Gardens. And then in the university, there's a big statue, a big bronze statue that was on the door, that was on the portico of this building that's in the university, which you might know. So, I mean, it's kind of really interesting how these, the volatility. I mean, they would never have done. Now, you know, a few years later they wouldn't have done it. It was just a crazy thing. Sorry, I digress. So yeah, so that was bought by water. Early on, the kind of stone was certainly bought by water from Tasmania, New Zealand, and New South Wales. That came round. That was all kind of shipped by boat. But the one at Stall, the quarry there, that really supplied most of the stone for most of the prestigious buildings. Although people did import other stuff by kind of cart and train later on, but none of these stones were anywhere near as successful as the Stall sandstone. And then after the Second World War, it became kind of obsolete, really.
I just wanted to ask you about the sort of follow-on in a way from Don's question earlier on about the relationship that people have with their built environments, and in particular some of these more detailed elements of it, but not in the context of Melbourne, but in fact Rochdale.
Ah, yeah.
Because you posted some pictures on Facebook about Rochdale and some lovely wooden cobbling. Yeah. Now, presumably, that's an example where the local people really value that. That particular, and I presume fairly distinctive fabric and form of paving. So is that? Do you get a sense that that's a sort of a common response? That recognition of something as mundane as everyday as the paving beneath your feet is something that people really value.
I kind of think that's happening. I mean, I sort of get the sense that, you know, archaeology, geography, architect, all sorts of disciplines are now turning to the much more mundane fabric, which I kind of find that much more interesting because it's there and we just take it for granted. We don't think about it. You know, the qualities of the bricks, the tarmac, the cobbles, the lintels and so forth, that we kind of, they're everywhere around us, but we don't, and we kind of tend to sort of venerate the kind of old and the kind of spectacular. But I think there is a kind of turn towards, I mean, would this have happened, you know, even 10 years ago? I don't know whether people would have kind of identified. So what it is, it's this local artist, not anybody involved in preservation or academia or archaeology or anything, but a local artist who he went round this down the street and he thought he saw these cobbles, and he thought he realised that they were wooden. There was just a few of them poking up under the concrete, and he lobbied hard for the council to take the concrete up, and they did, but they haven't heritageised it or anything. There's nothing there to tell you that this is a kind of wooden cobbled street, but the fact is it is there, and I tell you what, it's really nice to walk on. It's a real pleasure to kind of walk on this kind of wooden fabric. I want more wooden roads. They were kind of great. It's just a nice thing, and it's a generous thing as well, because it's there to muffle the sound of the cartwheels and the horses. You know, back when it was constructed in the sort of 19th century, because there was a hospital on this road, and it would have disturbed the kind of patients in the hospital. So there's something kind of quite nice about it. And I think there are always this kind of myriad of little stories and connections. I mean, I'll just give you another example. So I've just written, I was telling you, I wrote this little, I've just written a little paper on cobbles, only a very short thing. But so I went out and I was going to write this paper, and I realised there they were lining my street in the gutters. I guess they are in loads of streets, right? There's the tarmac. But actually, on many roads, they've left a sort of line of 3 or 4 cobbles that form the gutters. So I was looking at it, I think, oh God, I'm writing about cobbles, and there they are, they're right here outside my house. But then also, where the cobbles were, there was a grid, a water grid, right? Just a simple grid to let water down. And it said, made in Sheffield, that this forge. I kind of think that's interesting. You know, it's a relationship that Manchester and probably the council had to get supplies of drainage grids from Sheffield. They can, you know, this Steel City. And I kind of looked it up. It's all there on the inscription. It's quite beautiful, actually, when you look at it. It's a mundane thing. And the forge closed down in 1964, I think. So it was there. So there are all these interesting little connections that we can kind of identify in this kind of very mundane, everyday fabric. And I think people are starting to become more attuned to that. I think and maybe that's to do with kind of feeling a sense of loss of place. Maybe that kind of has solicited that. But also maybe just a kind of greater attunement to kind of what lies around us in kind of every day. I like to think so.
Any more questions? Sorry about the disturbing sound.
Oh no, it's quite soothing actually.
Okay. Any more final questions from anybody? Okay, Tim. Well, thank you very much. That's been really interesting, and it relates very closely to what we teach here. Conservation. You heard from Jill earlier on, who runs our conservation program, buildings, heritage, and cultural heritage management, and so on. So it lines up with everything that we do. Yeah. So very relevant. Well, if there's anybody has any ideas, I mean, as I say, this is just at the start of this project. So there's going to be a huge amount of research over the next 2 years, and there'll be a lot more stories. So if anybody has any kind of thoughts or ideas, that'd be very useful. So thanks very much. Okay. Thank you, Tim. So, as you know, we now go to the